that said, let's get this train started. Over to you, Morten.
Thank you. And Janus, thank you so much for the invitation. As some of you might know, the occasion is that I have been publishing a book that just came out recently. I call it the Strategy Playbook. It's the one you see to the right in the bottom of this screen. But that's just the I would say interlude of a very amazing story I've had with Janus so far that even go back further than 2022. But especially with the conferences in Aarhus, Boye 22, 23, 24, it's for me been quite amazing because every year has been like another step on my learning journey. So, Janus, I'm really appreciating the way you have been sponsoring my work. Most recently, we even traveled the world. So I think during 2024, I've been giving 50 plus presentations, not all of them with you. And we have been visiting 10 plus countries, most of those with you, to talk about this topic. So the question you asked me is, what have I learned about strategy? And I actually wanted to play it a little bit back, just sharing a memory here from one of the locations we visited, sort of a hot summer stay on a rooftop in a small country a little bit north of the US. What do any of you remember anything from the times you met me? Anything special? And for this occasion, I'm only asking about good things, just for the record.
All right,
Anyone who remember anything about what I talked about?
Thank you, Olivia, for volunteering. Anything you remember from, I think, that Berlin session?
I remember one thing basically is that there's basically two strategies that an organization or a business organization can take is keep the business or grow the business. I think that was one of the main. And then the other thing was like actually is to what I remember to have understood is that you have to have everyone on the strategy. That is not something that strategy is not something that is a management thing, but strategy is something that has to go through all the levels of an organization, and you must make sure that everyone's actually knowing what is the main reason for what people are doing. So it's like what the company is doing and so on. Yes. So I remember that. I think I've made some notes, but that's what is in my mind.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And actually, I really appreciate the learning you bring up, because just this week I started to get some feedback. I mean, the book is on Kindle self-publishing, so not much fanciness around this. But now I start to get feedback from people, and I realized that there's something I have done quite wrong. So I'm actually in the process of rewriting the whole thing as we speak. That's what happens. You write to rewrite. And the thing that dawned to me is that this is not about producing strategy. It's actually about consuming strategy. So people like us in the organization are consumers of whatever people are producing with this. And if we can somehow find a better way to do that, then that's a way to stay on strategy. I wanted to share with you on Janus's request just 3 things I have learned. So I'm doing this according to a very famous technique called 1, 2, 3 apple pie. And you will see what the apple pie is. That's for you. So the first thing, we talk about the gap, and I think the gap is very real. I mean, it meets me all the time. Just the other week, I visited one of the groups, and I was asking about the relationship people had with strategy, and a lot of them said we don't have any strategy. And then we started talking about it, and well, of course they had a strategy, but really the numbers you hear is that less than 15% of companies have a useful strategy. About 5% of people working in large organizations has any idea or understanding what it is. And then at the same time, they are not short of work to do. So despite the weak influence or the usefulness of the strategy in guiding where people invest time, typically there's just too much things going on. If you don't know better, it's like 3%. And I think what we need to do with this is to start consuming more of that strategy that is served for us. So not only having companies working local initiative using things like the black market for common sense, etc., but actually really make that connection, make that integration across the company. So we start talking about the shared aspiration and use that more deliberately for the choices we make. So the gap is real, number one. Number two. So this is a quite interesting one because most people are risk adverse, right? We really don't like taking risk. There are so many psychological experiments confirming that. But at work, man, we are willing to take all the risks. And some people even talk about blind risk taking, meaning that we a little bit overlook that whereas luck is hard work to work up the new market or whatever you're doing, then actually the unlucky side of things, that's a free fall. And people like Ben Flubia, some of you might remember him from when we talked about how big things get done, explicitly point out that that people take blind risks. So what we would like to do here is to be better at somehow holding a hand under those risks and make the bets we take affordable so that when we learn something new, we can better afford to take those learnings and in that sense, get to new innovations, etc. faster. I hope it's okay. There is a number 3 coming up, which is that if you want to be able to pivot fast, meaning change your mind, stop doing what you're doing in favor of something else, then actually you need some liquidity for that. And I like the word liquid because it's, or liquidity because it has 2 meanings. Liquidity is a bit like fluidity, you can flow with water, but liquidity also means that you have the cash to pay for whatever you need to do to make that adjustment. So in that sense, while it's not uncommon to be a little bit slow in picking up on new things, actually the whole idea of being on strategy, like we talked about, is to have a balance so that you can rebalance yourself into new and better options. And this also plays a little bit on the notion of luck, where a lot of people say that you cannot really control luck, but actually you can. So in the little bit more morbid end of the scale, you can say you can actually only be lucky if you're alive. So that's one way to play your luck. So if you keep your organization alive, then you have to have the upside for future luck. So basically, the more liquidity you build, the better you can adjust and change your strategy. Then what does it actually mean? This is the apple pie coming up. 3 things for you that you can do here and now. And we talked about a lot of these in some of the groups. So one is to actually find out what is your strategy, because everybody has one. And the interesting thing is that it's really about what's your idea, what's your aspiration, what action follows that aspiration, and what kind of choices do you make around that. And for those of you who remember a little bit of high school grammar, then strategy can be both an object and a subject of choice, meaning that sometimes it's the strategy that guides you, but sometimes you make a choice that changes that strategy. And what influences this is more and more the tensions, the disagreements, the paradoxes, etc., which are around us that suddenly release and show you new opportunity. And that's when that tension release happens, that you need to be able to act and change your mind into something more favorable. As a special gift for you, there is a template here you can play with, which is brand new. We have played a bit with it in some of the groups, but this is an idea based on the ideas on try to think about what are you doing at the moment. Then obviously, once you figure out what it is, you need to stay on it. And then from there, the idea is not to say, now we do this and nothing else, but actually the idea is to then really keep an eye out on what's going on, what kind of disagreements, dissatisfactions are you sensing, so that you can better adjust and meet those. This is the last aspect is something we discussed in Leeds. I remember at the end of my presentation, because a lot of people think of strategy as something which is positively forward going, but actually there's a lot of opportunity in picking up on things which are not being done well and do those better, and really sort of turn your strategic efforts in that direction. And if you remember the gap, to close the loop on the things I picked up on, and then I think we return and open it up for debate, questions and comments, etc. But the interesting thing is that it seems like people are not even trying. So some of the leading thinkers say that by just even trying to do this well, you can actually put yourself in a top tier category. And I'm really happy where I am with this at the moment. It's been quite of a long journey, but finally I feel that now it's coming together. And then yes, it is actually true that I rewrote the whole thing, and I'm driving my wife nuts, not for the first time. But that's also about the learning. So I'm really happy where this is in terms of tangible tools you can use to start dealing with strategy from a complex point of view. And for those of you who have been part of it, thanks a lot for helping and supporting me in that.
That's great, Morten. And now we have time for questions and answers. And perhaps I can start with one, Morten. If you go back to, I know it's a kind of a cliche in meetings, but if you don't mind going back a couple of slides to the first one, exactly, the gap is real. And I'm always intrigued by these gaps, disconnects that I think many organizations have between what it says on the website and how they really operate, or between what it says in the strategy and how they really operate. But one thing that I'm often trying to find out when I go to these group meetings and conferences, that's this question of who really calls the shots. And I find when I go into organizations, some are sales driven, some are marketing driven, at the end of the day, perhaps some are product driven. But I think that also comes back to these strategy gaps in terms of how decisions get made, what gets prioritized. I don't know if you could talk a little bit to I think you have even more experience than I do in navigating complex organizations and different sizes and trying to find out, how is this connected to strategy, Morten, is perhaps my question. Sales-led organizations versus marketing, design-led, all these different people who are calling the shots with or without a strategy.
Well, I think my main reflection is that when you look at this picture, and my former boss in Accenture always made this point that you have to be careful to not be derogative or sort of arrogant in the point of view, because of course most companies are great and they do it really well. And the way I reason around this, and I know you like the example, Janus, is this idea of the black market of common sense. So whenever there is guidance missing, well, there's a lot of warm, loving, well-meaning people who fill in the blanks and do something even better than what that guidance that they missed probably suggested, which means that things are going great. And the challenge is not so much with that. I mean, you could say, yeah, of course, it would be greater if it really was the big strategic plans that were the reason for the success and nothing else. But actually, it's great that you fill in those blanks and you do something even more clever. The problem is that when you start to face unexpected change and you need to have coordinated moves, then there is an inherent lack of transparency, and with that, lack of opportunities to coordinate. So that's really when this bites you. So I think with the examples you give, it really depends on the organization. I know typical consultant answer, but for example, a product-led organization will typically have a quite strong position on strategy because it's the product strategy that drives the product evolution. And if it's a good product manager, well, then that person really represents the strategy. And to make choices, you can just ask, and they will often have a very strong view. The better ones are willing to be challenged, but they would have a view, which means that you have clarity in execution, and in that sense are doing really well. And then anything in between to the sort of little bit mid-heavy classical bureaucratic larger organization, no names mentioned.
All right, very good. I can try to ramble another question, but before I do that, anybody else have questions, comments, reflections on strategy, and perhaps in particular Morten's speciality of strategy execution? Yes, let's go to not so far from here. Shannon first in Aarhus also.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought this question that you have here, how can we become better consumers of strategy? I thought that was a really great question, but I couldn't really connect that question to the next slide that you showed. I just wondered if you could speak a bit more to answering that question.
Okay, well, maybe we just step out of the slides. Well, it's almost so simple that I'm embarrassed I haven't thought about it before. And I think I have, but the thing is that we talk about strategy execution. You have a strategy, but then there is a gap in execution. And you hear very often is that the strategy is great, but there's a problem with execution. But then I was really thinking, but hey, come on. I mean, as employees in a large organization, we are the consumers of this strategy. I mean, there shouldn't be more strategy made than we can consume. And it resonates. I didn't bring it up here, but I have 6 criteria for what is now what I call contemporary strategy. And one of them is that it's got to be actionable, which actually means that strategy is constrained in context and time. It explains a lot of things that people get wrong. So in that sense, if you are in a context and you are facing some choices, then the strategy needs to be no more than good enough to help you make these choices. And if it doesn't, then you should change it to something that can. So that's what I mean by strategy being driven by the people consuming it, or you could also call it strategy on demand. I mean, you need no more strategy than the trouble you're dealing with, and hopefully it can help you with that. So thanks for answering. I think that's really at the crux on how you can even imagine to close some of these gaps that we continue to see.
I hope that.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to my favorite running sponsor, Rob.
I loved what you had to say, but I'd like to just kind of understand from the larger group here, like the stratification of strategy, because right now what you have is business strategy, and then you've got web strategy, and we're stuck with people in the AI strategy. So there's a quagmire with how big does it have to be, or how small can it be? And we're asking people to say, you know, the reason certain things don't get executed is there's this thought that their business strategy has to be unified with everything all the way down to something like an AI strategy.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So that comes from another thing, which is that traditionally you have thought of strategy to be the one thing that rules it all. So that means that you immediately translate it to action initiatives, and then those get delegated through the organization. What I'm saying is forget that. I mean, today organizations are a mess of warm, loving people forming their networks and solving problems for the organization. So imagine that we could take all of that and integrate it better, so that we could basically pick up on each and every context. What is the aspiration driving us? How is that guiding our action? Not so much worrying about the action, but how could we be better at aligning that ambition with other ambitions in our organization? So to your question, I mean, some people say that you have only one strategy. The same people say your strategy is not a plan. I think both are wrong. I think you have like 1 billion strategies, and then not all of those are useful, but the better you can somehow aggregate that and integrate that across, the better you can build that alignment or cohesion that can help make big dents and not just a lot of small dents in the universe. So that's really how I'm thinking about it. And then, of course, it all needs to add up. But the way to deal with that is that you are all consuming from the same jars of capacity. So there's a lot of things you can do to drive alignment and reconciliation from a more fluid point of just looking at what people are trying to achieve and why.
Thank you.
All right, then let's go to Canada. Ivo?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, from a very cold and snowy Montreal. I'm hoping that you could like shed some light on, when there's strategy, there should also be reward at the end of the road. And how do you bring people into that? Because, like strategy is not the same as having a goal and I'm not talking individual or financially or whatever, but there should be some type of reward. Like how do you vision going somewhere together, and how do you get people there? And like we are in the middle of a situation now where Canada is being overrun by Trumpism, and he's doing this thing called flooding the room. I mean, that's not really a strategy, that's just arrogance. But the reward of the strategy, and how does that work together?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So I would like not to go into Trump or individual monetary rewards, but I think they can be derived from this. In my experience, you often struggle with simply value tracking. I mean, how do you create value? And the way this idea supports is that you really see the strategy as an intent contribution conversation, a bit like aspiration action. So there is a certain part of the organization, there's a certain thing you want to achieve. If it's a crisis, it's very clear. Or if it's a deadline, it's very clear. But you can actually choose pretty much your intent. But then the question comes, how do each and everyone contribute? And what I have found is that you can actually underpin a conversation like this with OKRs. A lot of people like to not like them these days. It's kind of an anti-trend. I really like them. I think with the aspiration action pattern, it's the simplest form of strategy you can think of. So you can basically start identifying your stakeholders, identifying your stakeholder values, use those to express objectives, key results on a timeline that's like a roadmap. And then you can start looking at, well, with the objectives that you have and the outcomes that you are driving the roadmap, how does that aggregate up in real tangible value over time for whatever we are trying to achieve? And then from there, the step to sort of real money or real capacity is relatively simple, because you already have on a number of different stakeholder values, tangible things that you're looking to make better, and you can somehow track them both tangibly and intangible through this conversation of intent contribution. And this is just way, way better than most people have, because most people don't have value. And if they do, it's still not really numeric beyond maybe a few KPIs that they are tracking.
All right, very good. Then let's go to Anina.
Yes, as you can probably tell, I'm also in Aarhus together with Shannon. Yeah, so
Hey.
this question is a little hard for me to phrase, so bear with me. It's kind of piggybacking on what Shannon asked about this whole thing about consuming strategy, and I think you explained it very well, that it's about like, okay, how can there be how do we consume a strategy in the way that we can also do it contextually? And I was thinking, so the template that you showed on some slides later than this one, is that then the recipe or the template for creating a strategy that can be used contextually? And if so, how does that help that? Does that make sense?
No, exactly. So I had a review, but yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So I had one person commenting that I'm a strategist. I mean, I want something, and then I realized, but hey, come on, I'm not really writing this for strategists. I mean, because the world is very, very good at making strategies that people don't know and are not using. So I don't want to make that better. It really is a matter of where the strategy is needed to make it more useful for guiding those choices. And I have found that it's a really interesting example with a team or an organization to just simply ask, what strategy does it look like we are following? And then you can say, well, we have 1 billion, but then you can narrow it and say, okay, what are the big problems we try to solve? And typically you can make a strategy around that. You can say, okay, for this problem to solve, implementing this new technology, for example, how can we usefully think around this? What's our aspiration? What's our action? What does that actually mean, given other options we might have? Why did we pick this one? And even that conversation in itself is useful. and it's often quite remote from the overarching corporate level strategies. And then my point is that, well, if you can actually figure out what you're trying to do and how and what you need, then that's the view you want to integrate with the rest of the organization and make sure that you are not unintentionally doing other people harm or cannibalizing the opportunity from another place in the organization unknowingly.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I think we're coming up at the end, but I like the appetite for questions and, as usual, Morten's eloquence in answering them and offering helpful feedback. Anybody else here at the end? Closing notes? Just to get this right, Morten, you're rewriting the book because you actually wrote another book on producing strategy, and now you're focusing it on more on consuming strategy?
Yeah, so it's pretty much done, and it didn't change so much to the underlying things. I think the key thing was to just make clear, and the stuff I write is a bit messy, but it's the real thing. So it was about changing the perspective. Who is the target group for this message? And the way I put it, and it's a dedication in the book, is that this is for people who depend on corporate strategy. You can even see it on the scene here. And then, because it's an open world and there's room for all of us, so both the producers and the consumers. But I really want to side or part with the consuming side, the execution side, because that's where the point of gravity is moving when the intensity of change goes up, something that leads to other shifts.
Thank you, Morten.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for our joint learning journey. I really appreciate it. I will make sure to type this up, share the slides, share the recording, and look forward to continuing the conversation and also seeing hopefully all of you in person very soon. Thank you for joining. That's all we had.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for today.
Thanks.